By the summer of 1940, continental Europe had effectively fallen silent under German control. France, once considered an unbreakable military power, had collapsed in a matter of weeks. The Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, and Denmark had already been subdued. Nazi authority now stretched across much of Europe, enforced by occupation forces and collaborationist governments. This sudden collapse shocked the world and marked the complete failure of the post-World War I political order. Adolf Hitler stood at the height of his confidence, convinced that destiny itself favored his ambitions. Across the English Channel, Britain confronted a terrifying reality. The evacuation at Dunkirk had saved its army but stripped it of weapons, vehicles, and heavy equipment. Britain stood alone against a victorious Germany, facing the constant threat of invasion. Coastal defenses were strengthened, air raid shelters constructed, and civilians trained in emergency procedures. Despite fear and uncertainty, Britain refused to seek peace. The nation understood that surrender would mean the end of its independence. Winston Churchill emerged as Britain's defining wartime leader. His speeches carried neither false optimism nor promises of quick victory. Instead, he spoke openly of hardship, struggle, and sacrifice. Through radio addresses, he transformed fear into defiance, uniting the nation around a shared sense of purpose. Churchill framed the conflict as a fight for freedom itself, declaring that Britain would resist invasion at all costs. His leadership shaped not only military strategy but also national morale. For Adolf Hitler, Britain represented an unresolved threat. As long as the British Isles remained unconquered, German domination of Europe was incomplete. Hitler initially hoped Britain would negotiate peace after France's defeat, but this hope quickly faded. Plans were drawn up for an invasion of Britain under the name Operation Sea Lion. Yet the German High Command recognized a critical obstacle. Without control of the skies, any invasion force crossing the Channel would be annihilated. The war had demonstrated the decisive role of air power. Aircraft could destroy defenses, disrupt logistics, and terrorize civilian populations. Germany's Luftwaffe had proven its effectiveness across Europe. Britain's survival now depended on the Royal Air Force. Radar stations, fighter squadrons, and airfields formed the front line of defense. Control of the air would determine whether Britain survived or fell. In July 1940, the Luftwaffe launched its assault on Britain. German bombers targeted radar stations, coastal defenses, and airfields, aiming to cripple the RAF. Fighter escorts filled the skies as intense dogfights erupted daily. British pilots flew multiple missions under extreme pressure, often returning to damaged runways and hastily repaired aircraft. Losses mounted on both sides, but Britain's radar network allowed defenders to respond quickly and concentrate their forces where needed. Air combat was unforgiving and relentless. Pilots fought at extraordinary speeds, navigating chaos, smoke, and enemy fire. Decisions were made in seconds with fatal consequences for mistakes. Many aircraft fell in flames, leaving little trace of their crews. The skies over southern England became a constant battlefield. Courage, endurance, and skill determined survival. These battles would decide the future of Britain. As the air war intensified, civilians found themselves directly in the line of fire. Air raid sirens disrupted daily life, forcing families into shelters night after night. Cities prepared for mass casualties as emergency services struggled to respond. Despite constant danger, daily routines continued. Factories operated, transport systems functioned, and communities adapted. Civilian endurance became as vital as military resistance. When attacks on airfields failed to eliminate the RAF, German strategy shifted. Luftwaffe bombers began targeting major cities in an attempt to crush civilian morale. London became the primary focus. Night after night, bombers crossed the Channel, dropping high explosives and incendiaries. Fires spread rapidly through densely populated areas, destroying homes and historic landmarks. The goal was psychological collapse rather than military victory. The bombing campaign known as the Blitz lasted for months. Cities across Britain endured sustained attacks, often under cover of darkness. Rescue teams searched rubble for survivors as fires raged uncontrollably. Casualties mounted, and entire neighborhoods were erased. Yet morale did not collapse. Communities supported one another, and public resolve hardened. The Blitz demonstrated that civilian populations could endure prolonged bombing without surrendering. By the autumn of 1940, it became clear that the Luftwaffe had failed to destroy the RAF. British air defenses remained operational, and invasion plans were postponed indefinitely. This marked the first major failure of Hitler's war strategy. Britain remained unconquered. The assumption that Germany could defeat all opposition through speed and terror was broken. With Britain still standing, Hitler shifted focus toward his long-term ambitions in Eastern Europe. He believed that defeating the Soviet Union would secure Germany's future and eliminate a potential rival. The vast lands of the East promised resources, territory, and ideological conquest. Preparations began quietly for a massive invasion, even as bombing continued over Britain. Although Germany and the Soviet Union were bound by a non-aggression pact, mistrust defined their relationship. Both sides understood the agreement was temporary. German intelligence gathered information, and troops were positioned near the eastern frontier. Hitler viewed the Soviet state as weak and believed it could be destroyed in a swift campaign before it fully mobilized. Operation Barbarossa became the largest military plan in history. Millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and massive air fleets were assembled along the Soviet border. Logistics were stretched to their limits as supplies were stockpiled and routes prepared. German commanders expected a quick victory, believing the Soviet Union would collapse under the weight of blitzkrieg tactics. As Europe burned, the conflict expanded beyond the continent. Sea routes became battlegrounds, colonial territories were drawn into fighting, and global trade was disrupted. Nations that hoped to remain neutral found themselves affected economically and politically. World War II was no longer confined to Europe. It had become a global struggle with consequences for every major power. Despite continued bombing and isolation, Britain adapted to wartime reality. Industrial production increased, military organization improved, and international cooperation deepened. Britain's survival forced Germany into a prolonged conflict it had not planned for. Time and resources now worked against rapid German victory. By early 1941, the war reached a tense moment of uncertainty. Germany dominated much of Europe but faced unresolved threats. Britain remained defiant. The Soviet Union waited uneasily. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched events closely. Decisions made during this period would determine the future course of the war. The skies over Britain had burned, yet the island remained free. The invasion had failed, but the war had only grown larger. Germany now turned east, toward a conflict that would dwarf all others.